If you have your Bibles, we are going to be in Matthew chapter 22. Matthew 22, as we've been going through the book of Matthew together, verse by verse. I remember when Felicia and I had gone to candidate for our very first lead pastorate position in Rapid City, South Dakota, great church. We had gone in for interviews with their board and their search committee. All that had gone well. They had asked us to come back and meet the church and have a Sunday there and vote on us. And so on the Saturday before the Sunday, we had a meet and greet at the church on a Saturday morning with breakfast. And so Felicia and I were standing there, and we were greeting people as they were coming in. And it was just kind of a line, filing through, where you had 10 seconds or so with each person as they were walking through. And I still remember this to this day. One person, I don't remember who it was, or man, woman, young, old, I don't remember. But somebody's coming through, and they looked at me and they said, "If you come here, I hope we can stop doing hymns." And just went on. And I was like, well, that was odd. And then like 2 people later, the next person says, "If you come here, I hope we can start doing more hymns." And I was like, there's no win for these 2 people. They have put themselves at odds. I'm going to disappoint one of these 2 people. Have you ever been in a situation like that where no matter what you do, you're going to disappoint someone? I remember our very first Sunday there, I just finished preaching and had come down off the platform, and people were kind of still milling around, and somebody met me right at the front. And he said, "I have one question for you." Now, first time I've met this guy, at least that I had remembered, and he's got a question, so I know this is important. This is the first question he's going to ask me. And he looked at me and he goes, "Are you young earth creation or old earth creation?" I thought, this is not the first question that I want to answer with this guy. This is something that as we get to know each other and as you develop some trust, then we can start talking about more difficult issues like this. But I don't want this to be the very first thing that we say. And he just kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and he wouldn't let me go so finally I told him the way that I lean. I don't have a strong opinion. I have opinions. I told him which way that I lean on this question, and I never saw him again. So that was kind of sad. Questions can put us in tough spots. And Jesus, if you remember in Matthew 22, we are in what we would call today Holy Week or Passion Week. He's coming to Jerusalem for the Passover. And he has come in on the triumphal entry. He has come to the temple courts and the larger multi-acre temple courts and is having these interactions with people. And after he had healed and done and taught this all the way from chapter 21 to the end of chapter 23, this 3-chapter block has to do with his conflict with the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the teachers of the law, and the conflict that Jesus has with them. We've been talking about this for several weeks now. So in chapter 21, you remember this. There we go. The religious leaders had tried to stop Jesus by questioning his authority. Remember that question in chapter 1? They'd come to him, "By what authority are you doing these things?" This is really just straight up intimidation. What are they asking him? "Who do you think you are? You've come into Jerusalem from Galilee. We don't know you. We've heard about you. We've heard all kinds of things about you. Who do you think you are? Who gave you the authority to turn over the money-changing temples or in the temple? Who gave you the authority to do these things?" They are just flat out trying to silence him, intimidate him. And it didn't work. So what we see in chapter 2, the religious leaders try to stop Jesus by questioning his theology. And what we're going to see in the remainder of chapter 22 is a series of 4 questions that the religious leaders are asking Jesus, trying to put him in a no-win situation, trying to get him in a place where they can either stump him or they can trap him. Now, originally, as we were going through Matthew, I had thought that we would probably hit each of these 4 questions one at a time and do it over the course of a month. But as we've gotten into this, especially with the calendar, I would really love for us to be able to put a bow on this section of Jesus' conflict with the religious leaders before we head into Christmas season. So we're going to go kind of fast this week and next week. The rest of chapter 22, we'll do all of 23 next week. That'll put a bow on it. We'll start. We'll celebrate our Advent season and then start with chapter 24 in January. So if it feels like we're going fast this morning, it's because we are. So Matthew 22. Oh, hang on. Before we get there, so just to remind you, here's the setting. This is a model of Jerusalem with the temple courts. Jesus would have been teaching in here. This is where it's happening. Here's a picture today of, this is the Dome on the Rock. This greater area or near the Dome on the Rock would have been is the traditional site of the temple. This is the Mount of Olives out here. The triumphal entry would have come down this way. So Jesus is still, you can show the next one if you want. Jesus is still teaching in this area and having this conflict with them. So, verse number 15. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinions, for you are not swayed by appearances." They're laying it on thick, aren't they? I mean, they are laying it on thick. So we're going to see 3 different people. Who's going to be in this? So these are gross simplifications, but they're helpful. So the Pharisees, I would call them the pious conservatives. They were the ones who tithed on their mint and dill and cumin, and they were very, very, very detailed in their observance of the law. There was no law too small that wasn't worth obeying. They didn't like the Roman occupiers. They were conservatives. They were, never mind. I was going to make a political joke, and that was probably not going to turn out well for me. So, I was maybe going to say make Jerusalem great again, but I decided not to. It's a joke. The Sadducees, I would call them the powerful liberals. They were less numbers than the Pharisees, but they had more clout. Think in terms almost like we would think evangelicals and mainline Protestant Christians. Again, way oversimplifying. But the Sadducees, their biggest thing is that they believed in, and everything had to come out of the first 5 books of the Bible. Matthew. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The Torah. They focused on the Torah. Everything else didn't really matter. So there were all these questions and all of this theology that'd be derived from the Psalms or from the prophets or from Daniel. And the Sadducees were just like, psh, forget it. One of their big things that they're known for, we see it here, as we'll see in Matthew 22, and in Acts, you'll see this with the Apostle Paul, is that they didn't believe in the resurrection. They could not find any basis for the resurrection in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, and so they would cast away. The reason I say powerful liberals, they would just cast away large portions of Scripture that they didn't like. So, finally, the Herodians. Herodians were a small group. They were Jews loyal to Herod. Herod was the king of the area. He was appointed by Rome. So these were the people, never mind. These were the people that were loyal to Rome. They had gotten inside with the Roman occupiers and with Herod, and they were Herod's people. So the Pharisees send some people, and they bring the Herodians. The Pharisees did not like Rome. They were the conservatives. They were very concerned about their country. So we've got these 2 groups who politically are at different spheres, different ends of the spectrum. So these men show up, they lay it on thick. And verse 17, "Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, excuse me, said, "Why do you put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me a coin for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" And they said, "Caesar's." So they asked him this question, and this was a question of not just like civil law, but of the law of God. Not is it lawful for Rome, or is it lawful according to this, but are we sinning against God if we take our money and give it to Rome? And this was a debate in their day. Here's a couple of ideas of what the coinage would have looked like. I had some actual ones, but you just couldn't see it. So he shows them one of these coins, and it's got Caesar's picture on it. So what do you say, Jesus? This is their first trap question. What do you say? Because either way he goes, one group is going to be upset. One group is going to consider him a lawbreaker, either breaking the law of Moses or breaking the law of Rome. He is in a no-win situation. Look at what Jesus says. Then he said to them, "Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And when they heard it, they marveled and left him and went away. See, here's what happens, is they tried to put Jesus in a place to present him with a false choice. What's a false choice? It's when you say, well, we either have to go with A or B, and a lot of times those aren't really the only options, and we box ourselves into those things. And so they're asking him, A or B, do we pay taxes to Caesar, or do we not pay taxes to Caesar? And do we devote ourselves to God? And Jesus gives them an extremely wise response. The coins belong to Caesar. They've got his name on them. They've got his face on him. Let Caesar have him. But don't let that be an excuse in your devotion to God. Don't let that be a reason for you to be lax in your devotion to God. He is giving them a reason to be obedient as far as taxation goes to the Roman authorities, but to not give it an excuse to be non-obedient to God. And so they hear this, and the Pharisees and the Herodians were like, well, that didn't quite work out the way we expected. Pick up now on verse number 23. The same day the Sadducees came to him, who say there is no resurrection, and asked him a question, saying, "Teacher, Moses said," notice their appeal to the Mosaic books, "Moses said that if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother." Now, don't you love it how they like make up the most absurd scenario here that they could have? This is, they're almost like straw manning him, or when we get in debates with people, what do we do? A lot of times we like to try to take the worst argument they have, or the most absurd and extreme part of it, and poke holes in it. And that's kind of what they're doing here. So there was a brother. There were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. And so too the second and the third, and down to the 7th. And after them all, the woman died. And in the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife shall we be? For they all had her. They are mocking him. They're mocking Jesus, and they're mocking. Theologically, Jesus was closer to the Pharisees than he was of anybody else, which should make us pause. Jesus' issue with the Pharisees was not their theology, it was their hypocrisy. But that's a different sermon for another day. Jesus he's with the Pharisees in their theology of the resurrection. And the Sadducees are mocking the belief in the resurrection. They're making fun of it. They're saying, they're mocking it by making it so extreme to this. And so they lay out this case, and Jesus says, but Jesus answered them, "You are wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. So he first points out this. He's like, you don't understand how resurrection works. You don't understand what God is doing. That when, and Paul spells this out in 1 Corinthians 15, if we were doing just one sermon on this, I'd take you everywhere, but we got to go fast. He spells all this out in 1 Corinthians 15, that the body that dies is like a seed that goes into the ground, and what comes up is different. It's a body, but it's different in the same way that you plant an acorn and get an oak tree. You don't plant an acorn and get an acorn. You get an oak tree. And what he's saying here is he's spelling out that you don't understand the nature of resurrection bodies. You don't know how it's worked. In the resurrection, there is no marriage. There is no giving in marriage. There is no procreation. There is none of this. The resurrection bodies, they are bodies, but they are different. Paul calls them spiritual bodies, incorruptible. They're different. And so Jesus is pointing out to these Sadducees, you think that in the resurrection, we're just going to come back up and just be like this again. And he's like, no, it's different. You don't know the scriptures or the power of God. And then he says this, as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Now, for the Pharisees and for Jesus, the doctrine of resurrection would mainly have been developed out of the book of Daniel. Daniel's vision of the Son of Man on the throne and the nations are brought and the resurrections happen. This would have been as far as in redemptive history. If you've got creation and the fall and the flood and Abraham and Moses, that would have been where the first 5 books cut off, and then you've got the rest of the kings, and you've got the writings, and Daniel is like over here. So Daniel happened much later, and that's really where the theology of resurrection in Jesus' time had come out of, the prophet Daniel. Did you see what Jesus does here, though? He doesn't appeal to Daniel, does he? For these Sadducees, who does he appeal to? He goes back to the Torah. He appeals to them. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he's keying in on this word here, am. Am. He's not the God of the dead. He's not the God of the living. He's not saying to his people, because he made this statement 400 years after these men had died. He didn't say to Moses, I was the God of Abraham. I was the God of Jacob, Isaac. I was the God of Jacob. Wouldn't was have made more sense? He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astonished at his teaching. So the second question has come and gone now. The Pharisees and the Herodians tried to trip him up. Now the Sadducees had tried to trip him up. Now, Pharisees again. Look at verse 34. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, and when you see in Scripture this lawyer, it's not lawyer in the way that we understand it. It's like someone skilled and taught in the law of God. So someone who's, we would maybe say a professor or a theologian or an academic. So they brought out the smart dude here. All right, they brought out the big guns. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him, Teacher, which is the great commandment of the law? And these were debates they would have on. And so they would try to rank the 613 commandments that there were in the law of Moses and put them in order and do all of these things. And so they're asking him. And he said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. Next. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Let's keep going. On these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So now Jesus has been asked by the sophisticated, the teaching. Let's see how smart you are in the law. What's the greatest? And Jesus says this, quotes from the Shema from Deuteronomy 6:4, love the Lord your God with all your heart. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And we see this even as you look through that lens, even at the Ten Commandments. What do we see? The first 4 have to do with how we love God. The last 6 have to do with how we love one another. And if you just do those things, if you love God and you love people, the rest of the law and the prophets, Jesus is saying, hang on these 2 categories. The rest are just details. The rest are just filling in the gaps. And Jesus answers this question to their satisfaction, even to the satisfaction of one of their lawyers, teachers of the law. Here's one thing that's interesting about these 2, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus' twofold answer should warn Christians against emphasizing either piety for God or social concern at the expense of the other. We tend to fall in one of these 2 categories, don't we? We kind of want to go one way or the other. Someone who was just in love with God, and they pray and they worship and they read the Bible and they give and they do all these things, and God, them and God are just close, and they kind of forget about other people. And then there's others who kind of go the other way, and their entire relationship with God is built on what I can do for someone else, but when it comes to their own relationship with loving with God, it's not there. And Jesus affirms both of these. So what's going on here? What's happening? We've had these 3 questions. What's happening? Let's see next. Jesus is not a bumpkin from Nazareth in Galilee, as they suppose. Right? Do you remember what Nathanael said when his brother Andrew said, I think we have found the Christ? Nathanael said this, Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? I thought about making a joke about Arkansas, but I decided against it, in case you're from Arkansas. And so you would imagine as Jesus comes into Jerusalem and they had heard about him, he was a bumpkin from Nazareth who has not been schooled in the ways of Jerusalem by the master rabbis. He's a bumpkin from Galilee. We couldn't shut him up by threat. By whose authority are you teaching these things? Now let's make him look stupid. Let's expose him for who he is. But what has he shown? He's wiser than the wisest minds in Jerusalem. He's wiser than the wisest minds in Jerusalem. He's come and he's answered the questions of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians. And when they hear his questions, they go, all right, we're not having a battle of wits with this guy because we're all losing. But that's not where the text ends. That's not where the story ends. That's not all. There's one more question to be asked. And that's not a question asked by the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the Herodians or even the chief priest or a lawyer or any of these. The next question comes from Jesus. I love this. Now, when the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question, saying, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" And they said, "The son of David." And he said to them, "How is it then that David, by the Spirit," he's calling the Psalms inspired, which the Sadducees wouldn't have liked, but he's dealing with Pharisees here. "How is it that David, by the Spirit, calls him being the Messiah, calls him Lord, saying," and then he quotes from Psalm 110:1, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet." So this is the phrase here that Jesus is calling into question. By asking them, whose son is the Messiah, the son of David, that would have been just a stupid, simple question. What color is the sky? Blue. Whose son is the Messiah? David. This is easy. So he's saying to them, then what does this phrase mean? So let's look at it at Psalm 110. It makes more sense there. Do you notice go back to notice the capitalization here? The Lord said to my Lord. This is easier to see in the Psalm. Have you ever noticed in your Old Testament that sometimes you see Lord like this, and usually it's capital, but the R, O, R, and D are like this tall? Have you guys ever seen that in your Bible? No? Yes, okay. And then sometimes you see Lord that looks like this. Have you ever wondered what the difference between this Lord and this Lord is? If you haven't, I'm going to tell you. The difference between, as you're reading your Old Testament, between this Lord and this Lord are different Hebrew words. Very important, different Hebrew words. When you see this Lord, all caps, that means Yahweh, God's covenant name, his personal name. And they so honored and respected the name of Yahweh, trying not to take the Lord's name in vain, that as they were reading the scriptures and the Hebrew would say Yahweh, they wouldn't say Yahweh, even though the scripture said it, they would say Lord, Adonai. And so they would say it, but it would be written there, because if you can't take the Lord's name in vain if you never say it, was their idea. So as they're reading it, it would say Yahweh, and they would write Lord. That was so common that when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, they actually used the word Adonai, which is why you see in Matthew's version both Lords. They just kind of changed it to Lord. This word here just simply means Lord, Master, Adonai. So what we see here when we look at it from Psalm 110, Yahweh says to my Lord, whose Lord? Yahweh says to David's Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. So in their culture, people that had come before, generations that had come before, were greater than the generations that came after. Because my kids wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for me, so I'm greater than them. And I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for my dad, so he's greater than me. And it just goes, and the farther you go back, the hierarchy goes up and up and up and up. And so as you were going, up your family tree, they were your lords, and down your family tree it wasn't. And Jesus points out this phrase here. How is it that and Psalm 110 was known to be a messianic psalm. If this Lord is the Messiah, how can David call him Lord when he's his son? If then David calls him Lord, going back to Matthew 22, how can he be his son? And no one was able to answer him a word. From that day, did anyone dare ask him any more questions? All right, we'll stop playing this game with Jesus. What they didn't realize who the Messiah was going to be. They didn't realize that the Son of David wasn't just going to be a political Messiah. He was going to be the Son of God. And the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool for your feet. So what's going on here? Jesus is not only wiser than the wisest minds of Jerusalem. He's not just smart. He's not just a good rabbi, a good teacher, who they thought because he was in Galilee that he wasn't anybody. But then they came and they found out that, man, that guy is smart. That's not all that's going on here. What's going on? He is the promised Messiah of Psalm 110. This is what's going on. It's not just that Jesus is smart. It's that he is the fulfillment of Psalm 110. When David said, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. When he says later on in Psalm 10, rule in the midst of your enemies. When he says, I will make you a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. All this is in Psalm 110. Jesus is that Messiah. He is not just a smart teacher, a smart prophet. He is the fulfillment of Psalm 110. He is the Messiah. And then one day, about 60 years later, John on the Isle of Patmos has a vision. And he sees the fulfillment of Psalm 110. He sees the Lamb on the throne. He sees, look how John records it in Revelation 5:11. And then I looked and I heard around the throne. This is what Psalm 110 was about, wasn't it? It was about the throne. I saw the throne and the living creatures and the elders and the voice of many angels numbering myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands saying with a loud voice, "Worthy is the Lamb," that's Jesus. "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing." John sees Jesus, the Lamb on the throne with the wisdom of God reigning over his enemies. That's what's going on here. Jesus is not just a smart teacher. He's our Messiah. He's our King. He's the one whose rule will never end. He sits on the throne of David to establish it with righteousness and justice from this time forth and forevermore. That's who he is. And the King, the fulfillment of Psalm 110 comes to Jerusalem. And what are we seeing? Jerusalem rejects him. The religious leaders reject him. But we today delight in his rule and his reign, the King of Psalm 110 who reigns, and we devote our lives to him.